Welcome back to the Poetry of Emily Dickinson. Today we are talking about Dickinson and death. So we've already seen in many of the poems that we've read for previous weeks of the class meeting the prevalence of death as a theme or even as a character, a figure in Dickinson's poetry. So today we're asking how her poetry engages with death and how she describes the relationship between life and death, or the living and the dead, in her poetry. But this brief lecture that I want to give is actually more about the historical and political contextualization of Dickinson's most productive poetic period, which is the period of the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. Most of the poems that we read in preparation for this class meeting or this lecture were written in 1862 or 1863, thereabouts, right in the middle of the Civil War. So I want to provide some contextualization, but this is by no means an exhaustive description of the American Civil War. If you're interested, there are plenty of really detailed analyses, explanations on YouTube that you can take a deep dive into. So let's jump in. One of the poems that we read for today really directly engages with the Civil War context. Not many of Dickinson's poems do, so this is a little bit unusual, and we'll use this to frame our thinking about this historical context. When I was small, a woman died. Today, her only boy went up from the Potomac, his face all victory. To look at her, how slowly the seasons must have turned, till bullets clipped an angle, and he passed quickly around. So in these first two stanzas of this poem, we learn that the speaker knows this family from whom the mother died when she was young, and the only son of this mother now also died in the Civil War. We see that metrical pattern that we were thinking about last week that mimics hymns and other popular songs in the period. And this sort of has the feeling of a ballad because of that. A story is being told. So in 1861, the US was made up of states who recognized slavery as legal and the slave trade as legal, and states in which slavery was illegal. And so you can see this split here on this map from Encyclopedia Britannica. The northern states, they say loyal here because they were loyal to the United States. And then the southern states that were primarily slave states. So one of the reasons why it's important to talk about the American Civil War and this division in the country before the Civil War broke out, and then this division in two countries as southern states seceded and declared themselves as part of the Confederate States of America, is because this was really the first conflict that Americans experienced at home, whether or not they had loved ones involved in the fighting, though of course many did. And what I mean by that is because of the advent of photography and the increasing cheapness of print and the speed of circulating information around the country because of trains and other industrial developments that we've talked about in weeks past, people could keep up with this conflict not quite in real time, but almost, and as close as they ever had. At the same time, other industrial developments made this an incredibly deadly war, as weapons were more easily accessible and made more powerful. And of course, civil wars are always deeply upsetting because you're fighting against people who were just your countrymen days or months before, maybe even family members who lived in a different region. So all of these factors make this something that was very much at the center of cultural consciousness in the United States in this mid-19th century period. So here's just kind of a brief timeline. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but just some things to keep in mind that by 1861, when the Civil War began and South Carolina, or in 1860, I mean, when South Carolina secedes from the Union, in 1861, when the Civil War officially begins after the Confederate States have elected their president and approved a constitution. It was really a slow burn to get to this point. So slavery provided the economic backbone for most of the southern states, especially because the South remained primarily agrarian. That is, their economy was built on agriculture, even as the North became more economically dependent on manufacturing and industrialization. And that's a little bit of a generalization, right? There were farms in the North, factories in the South, but it's important to understand how valuable enslaved labor was economically for these Southern agrarian states. So valuable that they were willing to secede from the United States and create the Confederate States of America in order to preserve that economic security. So the war starts in 1861. By 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation, which proclaims that enslaved people in secessionist states, those states that left the United States, now called the Confederate States, were free. As the war comes to a close around 1865, the 13th Amendment is ratified. In 1865, the Confederates also surrender around April. And there are a few skirmishes after that point, but we always look at this April 9th, Robert E. Lee surrendering to Ulysses S. Grant as sort of the symbolic ending of the war. And shortly thereafter, Abraham Lincoln, who is the president of the United States during the whole period of this conflict, is assassinated. So there's a lot going on in this short period of time that is being sent around the country through newspapers, through letters, through photographs, and people are really engaging in this in a way that they hadn't in previous conflicts that the United States had been involved in. So this is something that really is at the forefront of conversations, of things that people are reading. And Dickinson was no exception to that because, as we've discussed, she corresponded so widely with friends and family members. Even though she spent most of her time at home, she was very involved in keeping up with the events of the war. So none of Dickinson's immediate family members, her father or her brother, fought in the war, but Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who we've met in previous weeks, who was Dickinson's friend and poetic mentor, was a commander, and a dear friend of her brother Austin died in the war. Dickinson writes in her letters commenting on various events. She especially mentions the capture of Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, and a letter to her sister when she was away from home receiving some medical treatment. And she makes a little bit of fun about how Jefferson Davis was found dressed as a woman. She pokes fun at that event. So what I hope that you can tell just from this really brief overview of the historical context is that this was a huge conflict, a bloody conflict, something that people in the United States were thinking about in a way that they really hadn't had to think about conflicts in the past because of how easy it was to access information about it. And especially with the advent of photography, to actually see what was going on the battlefield in a way that folks hadn't previously. So the end of the poem that we started with, "When I was small, a woman died," really kind of encapsulates that. But proud in apparition, that woman and her boy pass back and forth before my brain as even in the sky. I'm confident that bravos perpetual break abroad for braveries remote as this in scarlet Maryland. And so Dickinson's speaker talks about seeing the woman and her son, both now dead, both apparitions, constantly passing back and forth before her brain. And I think that's a helpful articulation of what it was like to experience the Civil War in real time, to see these images of soldiers who have died or been injured constantly passing back and forth before your brain, not just in the sky, not just in faraway heaven. And in the final stanza, the speaker says that they're confident that bravos perpetual break abroad for braveries remote as this in scarlet Maryland, really emphasizing the hope and the ways in which stories are circulated widely about figures like this boy In newspapers, poems and stories from soldiers who were fighting on the front lines were often circulated. Um, and the speaker tells us that and hopes that they will extend beyond the United States abroad. So, one way that we can think about this context in which Dickinson was writing, even though her poems don't directly engage the Civil War that often, is to think about the process of revision that she undertakes. So, we have two versions of a poem here, one written in 1859 and one written in 1861. And while we don't know for sure that Dickinson revised in response to the events of the Civil War, and in fact, we don't actually know exactly when in 1861 this poem was written, or revised, I should say, because there was such a slow burn politically, socially to the actual conflict of the Civil War, we might be able to read some of that political context into our understanding of the revisions that Dickinson makes to these two poems. So, first, safe in their alabaster chambers, untouched by morning and untouched by noon, sleep the meek members of the resurrection, rafter of satin and roof of stone. Light laughs the breeze in her castle above them, babbles the bee in a stolid ear, pipe the sweet birds in ignorant cadence. Ah, what sagacity perished here. So, things that we immediately notice in this poem is the rhythm. It's pretty rhythmically consistent. There's some alliteration, repetition of consonant sounds or first letter sounds in the second stanza in particular. Breeze, babble, bee, bird, that repeated sound that creates consistency. So, alabaster chambers, we might read that as graves or tombs, right? Made of alabaster, untouched by morning and untouched by noon. They're enclosed underground. And when we hit this fourth line, sleep the meek members of the resurrection, that really kind of confirms that reading, right? So, members of the resurrection, if we remember from last week, perhaps the elect, those who are going to go to heaven, currently are just sleeping, waiting to be resurrected under rafters of satin, grave clothes, or something like that, and roof of stone in that tomb. In the second stanza, the natural world is very lively, laughing, babbling, piping all around these alabaster chambers. The curious line that this poem ends on is something that we might think about. So, ah, what sagacity perished here. Oh, what truth perished here. What is that referring to? Is it the person who died? Is it the hope of the resurrection? The speaker leaves that up to interpretation. So we can use all of these clues in the poem to think about what that might mean. But in 1861, when Dickinson revises this, the first stanza stays round about the same. We have the addition of a dash, which might change the way that we read the poem, give us pause. The last two lines of the first stanza in the 1851 or 1859 version are combined into one in 1861, and an exclamation point is added, more emphasis. Rafter of satin, roof of stone. It makes our voice rise a little bit. But it's really the second stanza in which we see the most revision. There's really nothing that carries over between these two. Safe in their alabaster chambers, untouched by morning and untouched by noon, lie the meek members of the resurrection, rafter of satin and roof of stone. Grand go the years in the crescent above them, worlds scoop their arcs and firmaments row. Diadems drop and doges surrender, soundless as dots on a disk of snow. So we're immediately shifting from a focus on birds and bees and light, these sort of gentle and lively and also kind of minute. Bees are tiny, birds, there are tons of birds, but we're focusing in on these smaller parts of nature in the first version. into something really cosmic in this later version. Grand go the years and the crescent above them. Worlds scoop their arcs. There's a real emphasis on shapes like crescents, arcs, dots, discs, these circular shapes of continual movement that we saw in the poem that we read last week, Papa Above, this idea of continual circular movement. Something that this brings to mind for me is the idea of the celestial spheres. In early modern into the 18th century, astronomy and astrology, folks designed these maps, ways of mapping the heavens, so to speak. And here are just a couple of different depictions of that to understand how seasons work together from an astrological perspective, to understand what temperaments people might have, what events might happen. And in Dickinson's context, these ways of thinking about space are changing. We'll talk more about that in the week on science, but this idea of circularity, of movement, of constant movement is something that she's referring to here in this second stanza in the revision. And so we might consider from 1859 to 1861 why she makes this shift to cosmic events. We don't see any birds or bees. We see firmaments, worlds, right? These really big things. In the second to last stanza, diadems drop and doges surrender. So crowns, diadems fall, doges, magistrates surrender. These big world events, some of which might be reflective of actual political circumstances in 1861, right? They're not named, they're just generalized. And here we have a repeated D sound in these final stanzas. It's pretty hard. It's kind of definite. Diadems, drop, doges, dots, discs. And all of this is soundless as dots on a disk of snow. So those final two lines in the 1859 and 1861 version kind of seem to be talking about the loss of something, right? In 1861, there's maybe a loss of specificity. All of these big events are just soundless as dots falling on snow, snow that kind of famously muffles sound. Truth has perished in 1859, but the way that the speaker articulates these things is really pretty different. So I'll stop there, but going back and looking at these two poems, thinking about the revisions that Dickinson made can help us better understand how to read Dickinson. What different choices is she making? How is this representative of a growth in her as poet? In 1861, she's entering that period in which she's writing so much, and we have more than half of her poetry written over the next 4 or 5 years. And also, what choices did she make before that she's now revised? And how can that help us understand what this poem might be saying? So there's lots going on in the historical and the political context. We talked about religion last week, which of course informs the way that Dickinson thinks about death. So this week's readings were What Inn Is This? Safe in Their Alabaster Chambers, which we just read together. I Felt a Funeral in My Brain. After great pain, a formal feeling comes. I heard a fly buzz. It was not death, for I stood up. When I was small, a woman died, which we saw excerpts from. And because I could not stop for death. So as you read these poems, or if you've already read them, as you go back and think about them more, consider the tone, consider the word choice, consider the ways in which rhythm and content are working together. We talked a bit about repeated sounds, alliteration, consonants, assonants are things to look for, repeated consonant sounds or repeated vowel sounds. Continue thinking about how form and content work together to articulate something about death or life or the relationship between the two of them. And we will be back next week to talk about science and maybe talk about life in a little bit of a different way. So thanks for joining. Feel free to leave any thoughts in the comments, read along with us, and I'll see you next week.